Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this evening. My name is Irene Caraccioni, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a KU student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this evening's event, if you would like to know more about our guest, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the event description below. At the end of this evening's event, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guest. Please email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. And now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Institute, Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much, Irene. Very nice job. Welcome, everyone, to the first part of the 2021 Presidential Lecture Series. Tonight, we'll be talking about the Republicans as we talk about the Reagan Playbook. Our guest for this series, which is going to be a lot of fun, and which is very important, especially right now at this point in time, is Richard Norton Smith. He's a great friend of the Dole Institute, a presidential historian. He was the first permanent director of the Dole Institute of Politics, and his what I think will be a landmark biography of President Ford will be coming out in the spring of next year. Richard, thank you very much for joining us. We're delighted to have you back.
Thank you, Bill. It's always good to be even in this fashion part of the Dole Institute.
Well, let's go to the subject at hand, Richard. I think both of us would agree that we're starting with Republicans because they need a little bit of advice and they need to hear a little bit of history, I think. So let's start by talking about President Reagan. We've talked a lot about him over the years in our various lectures, presidential lecture series, but talk about why you think President Reagan, like President Obama felt, was a transformational figure.
Well, I tell you, it's almost impossible to answer that question without including his boyhood hero, the other transformational president in the 20th century, FDR. And I know we'll be talking more about him next week, certainly in connection with the inspiration or example that he may provide for the Biden administration. Ronald Reagan, as a young man, voted for Franklin Roosevelt 4 times. And indeed, I think to the end of his life, he never accepted the notion that the Reagan Revolution, so-called, was in fact a reversal of the Roosevelt Revolution that occurred during his youth, and that would affect American politics and public policy for 50 years after FDR died. In fact, in some ways, we're still living in the world that FDR created. Every time you cash a Social Security check or watch a United Nations debate, you know who's responsible. Ronald Reagan was as transforming a figure in our time, I would argue, as FDR was in the middle of the 20th century. It's hard to imagine now the degree to which, say, in November 1964, people were understandably looking at that year's election returns, inclined to write off the Republican Party and certainly conservatism. It was pointed out that 27 million people did not vote for Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. They voted for Barry Goldwater and his quasi-libertarian brand of flinty conservatism, certainly anti-New Deal, as well as anti-Great Society. But it turns out that Barry Goldwater was a man ahead of his time, call him what you will, And Ronald Reagan got his, in effect, political start in the Goldwater campaign with a now famous speech that was delivered in October of 1964. Didn't win a lot of votes for Goldwater, but it did wonders for Reagan, whose movie career at that point was pretty much over, and who was someone who had undergone, and this is I think a key to beginning to understand Reagan. He had the passion of a convert. He had, as I said, grown up a liberal Democrat, an FDR enthusiast in the Reagan house in Dixon, Illinois. The New Deal was something very personal. His father, Jack, actually got a job with the WPA at one point. The last Democrat that Reagan voted for in 1948 was Harry Truman. And by 1952, although still nominally a registered Democrat, he had become essentially a Republican, voted for Eisenhower over Stevens in that year, and would, in effect, never look back. And when I say he had the passion of a convert, it is a profound intellectual transformation that, and philosophical, ideological, if you will, transformation that Ronald Reagan underwent before he was ever in a position to be a transformational president. He became a champion of Goldwater-like smaller government, certainly lower taxes, something that he had felt keenly as a Hollywood movie star who saw 80-90% of his income taxed, certainly by the time of the Second World War. In any event, and also a reaction. Remember, Reagan had been elected governor of California in 1966. I would argue that 66 is really the beginning of the age of Reagan, if you will. The country was increasingly roiled by the Vietnam War, which was increasingly unpopular. The civil rights movement had achieved much of its stated goals, and although 50 years later, I think we can all agree we're far from achieving racial justice or the really honoring all of the promises that we made to ourselves at the beginning of the Republic. Nevertheless, there was undoubtedly something of a backlash setting in by the late 60s. There was a sense the country was, the country had been a consensus country. In 1960, Nixon and Kennedy found it wasn't easy to find things to debate in their famous debates. That's one reason why style, historians say, triumphed over substance in that year's election. By 1964, there was beginning to be, of course, this divide between those who believed that what began with the New Deal, the increasing flow of power to Washington, the central role of Washington in the economy, on the global scene, the projection of American power, indeed American empire, and on the other hand, first Goldwater and then arguably Reagan, you sort of look at just about the opposite to any of those things, with an important caveat, with an important exception. And there's no doubt that certainly Reagan's kind of conservatives, not all, but Reagan's brand of conservatives, believed in a very muscular defense posture, and were not averse to sending troops or otherwise defending what they perceived to be American interests abroad. So anyway, as usual, we didn't know in 1966 that we were going through the beginnings of a political earthquake. But the fact of the matter is, we were. Ronald Reagan was elected that year, in part on his own strength as a candidate, but also in a rejection of the you might call it the liberal status quo. Things like, for example, campus unrest in California, which was a major issue, and which redounded very much to Reagan's benefit. And it turned out he was an effective governor. Was reelected in 1970, and in 1976 did the almost unthinkable, ran against an incumbent, albeit appointed, Republican president, Gerald Ford, came within a whisker of defeating him at the party's convention in Kansas City. And then 4 years later, defying the odds, defying convention. Remember, Ronald Reagan was the oldest man at that point in American history ever to be elected president. He began the transformation of attitudes, for example, about the economy. For the last 40 years, really, Ronald Reagan's Republican Party has agreed on tax cuts, strong defense, cultural conservatism, however you define that. For example, anti-abortion, but in ways that I don't think even now are fully appreciated, Reagan put his personal stamp on the Republican Party and on conservatism in a way that I can't think of anyone else who can match. And I mean, for a long time, people thought of conservatives as Herbert Hoover, a rather dour man associated with the Great Depression in a high collar and not a particularly appealing figure on the human level. The people, he didn't make it easy to know him. Reagan did something quite remarkable. Reagan put a smile on the face of conservatism. And more than that, Reagan took conservatism, which many people perhaps mistakenly interpreted as a kind of a unquestioning celebration of the past. And Reagan made it all about the future. Reagan was optimistic and Reagan was futuristic. And those were qualities that he introduced along with the principles and the policies that I think contributed to the phenomenon of Ronald Reagan. In addition, there's no doubt, just as with FDR, there was a personal legend that grew up around Reagan. People who were alive in March of 1982 are unlikely to forget the assassination attempt on President Reagan, which was televised, and more to the point, the extraordinary grace and humor that he showed that day and in the days that followed. A steady stream of jokes and witticisms, which really, I think, defined Reagan in ways that politics alone didn't. In other words, the nature of modern American politics, as anyone who's watching this program knows for themselves, is in its performance art. And millions of dollars are spent to craft images, to craft personalities, sometimes where none exists. Ronald Reagan had been elected president in 1980. And in March of 1981, I'll correct myself, March of 1981, just 2 months into his presidency, when the assassination attempt took place, something happened. Real life broke in. The real person emerged. We found out that it was an unscripted reality show, if you will. We learned things about Ronald Reagan that the campaign by itself had not taught us. And by and large, whatever our political persuasion, we were impressed. We were more impressed with Reagan, the man, than we had been. Remember, you could argue that Reagan's election in 1980 was less an embrace of his conservative platform, anti-tax, in some ways anti-government platform, than it was a rejection of the status quo represented by Jimmy Carter.
Richard, how did President Reagan's demeanor, style, and sense of humor help him connect with the American people?
Well, the question almost answers itself. You're absolutely right. There was a warmth. I mean, there was a paradox, because to be perfectly honest with you, there were many people at the time who scratched their heads. I think Tip O'Neill was probably one of them, the Democratic Speaker of the House. They couldn't quite reconcile the Reagan policies, which were, in their estimation, something less than warm and friendly and feel good, with the Reagan persona, which was all of those things and more. People found it impossible to dislike Ronald Reagan, and that really spanned the ideological spectrum. You still talk to old timers on both sides of the aisle who look back to that period, relatively speaking, as one of considerable civility, in no small measure because of the tone that was set by the president. There was no doubt what Reagan wanted in terms of policy, and people admired that. I'll tell you one thing that I think established a unique bond with Reagan, between Reagan and the American people. First of all, there was the assassination attempt, when people saw him without his handlers. They saw what they thought was the real man. Later that year, I believe it was in August, the air traffic controllers in America went out on strike. Now you have to remember, the air traffic controllers union was one of the very few major unions that had endorsed the Reagan-Bush ticket in 1980. And, in the conventional sort of cynical view that lots of us fall into where Washington is concerned, it would be the last thing in the world to imagine that a president who, in some small degree at least, owed his election to these people would do what Reagan did. And what Reagan did was basically give them, I believe, 48 hours. And if they were not all back on the job, then they were terminated. And again, it was only in retrospect, I think, do we see the full significance in a number of ways. First of all, you have to remember that there was a lot of cynicism in America about the political process. There were people who wondered if the presidency had not become too big a job for one man. And he was someone who came into office with relatively modest expectations, it must be said. I mean, there were lots of people in January 1981 who thought that Ronald Reagan was a one-term president, that he was too old, that he was too right-wing, that he was too Hollywood, whatever blank you want to fill in. And Reagan made a lifelong career out of confounding his critics. In many ways, he profited from being underestimated. And that was certainly displayed in March at the time of the assassination attempt, but even more in terms of public policy. He was a president who basically said what he was going to do, however radical it might appear to more conventionally minded politicians. Of course, see, Reagan never thought of himself as a politician. I mean, he had that remarkable capacity to convince himself that he was not a politician, although he was clearly hugely gifted, that he was a citizen, in effect, almost like Cincinnatus, called to office. But in any event, the other thing, of course, that the firing the air traffic controllers there are a lot of people who will tell you that they date the decline of organized labor in many ways to that event, and that obviously engenders strong feelings to this day. That's, by the way, another way that we know Ronald Reagan is a transformative president. You can still get a heated debate going just by mentioning his name. That seems like a curious posthumous tribute, but believe me, when's the last time you heard people arguing over Chester Arthur or Franklin Pierce? The final point, of course, that about the air traffic controllers. Remember, Reagan had come into office perceived as a hardline anti-communist, someone who would probably never get along with the Kremlin. And interestingly, the Kremlin tended to underestimate Reagan until the air traffic controller strike. And then they had second thoughts that he was someone who was potentially a more formidable opponent than they thought he would be.
How far, Richard, has the Republican Party moved away from the style and the ideology of President Reagan?
Well, and again, here we go. I'm walking on a thin ice. The very nature of, in some ways, to answer your question, anything I say about the most recent Republican president is bound to alienate half of our audience, which was not true about Reagan. Reagan was a gentleman. He was kind of an old school in a lot of ways, who looked upon, and Gerald Ford was very much the same way, who looked upon people on the other side of the aisle as perhaps misguided and certainly ideologically in need of correction, but they were adversaries. They were not enemies. And that is the single biggest change. And it's bipartisan, but there's no doubt that it has been, well, I said Reagan put a smile on the face of conservatism. I haven't seen that smile in the last few years. There is another strain of conservatism that is isolationist, that is exclusionary, that is thoroughly off-putting. And that undoes, in a lot of ways, it seems to me, what Ronald Reagan was able to accomplish. Reagan built a Republican Party that was very much the proverbial big tent. His Republican Party, for example, benefited enormously from the addition of blue-collar workers. Many people who might in the past have been loyal Democrats or whose parents had been, say, New Deal Roosevelt Democrats by the 1980s, they might not have re-registered as Republican, but in their mind, they had become Reagan Republicans. And that was a phenomenon. That was one of the things that he transformed. He transformed the Republican Party internally. He transformed conservatism. He transformed the appeal, the political clout, if you will, of republicanism, conservatism. He made it a majority school of thought. And somewhere along the line, people forgot that politics is the art of multiplication, not division. And we got into this gridlock where it's all about the base. If you turn out your base, which means in some cases riling up your base, and anger tends to be a stronger motivating force than the opposite. In any event, Reagan wasn't an angry conservative. Reagan was an upbeat conservative. Reagan believed that the future, in effect, belonged to conservatism, unlike, I think, some of his would-be heirs, for whom the future is a scary place.
Well, Richard, I have one more question on President Reagan, and then we will shift gears and talk a little bit about the Kansas native son, Ike. But what characteristics of President Reagan should the Republican Party look for in future Republican leaders and candidates for president?
Well, that's an editorial question. I mean, in some ways, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to give anyone advice on that. It seems to me, however, the history, and we're far enough now removed from the Reagan presidency. By the way, it's also indicative of his historical significance and relevance that it's been, 30 years? More than 30 years since he left the White House. And I think the question can be raised if, in fact, finally the age of Reagan is giving way to something else. I mean, clearly in the Republican Party, it has given way to something dramatically different. But nationally, there was a consensus that Ronald Reagan forged and that I think outlived him for the better part of 3 decades. That was inherently suspicious of government solutions, that at least philosophically embraced the idea of less is more where government is concerned, lower taxes, local solutions. But it's interesting because the combination of factors in recent years, certainly including the pandemic that we are still tragically experiencing, and the economic problems. First of all, the economic collapse in 2008 and the more recent fall. I think those factors, plus just the passage of time. I said the FDR coalition, if you will, the consensus about New Deal America outlived FDR, I would argue, by close to, certainly 40 years, by which time it was, in effect, replaced by a new consensus built around the ideas and the personality of Ronald Reagan. Well, we're almost 40 years after that, so I don't know if there's something of a formal cyclical nature, but it's time for us to be opening ourselves to alternative ways of an alternative consensus, if you will. And it will be very interesting to see if the Biden administration, which, judging from early evidence, seems to have learned some of the lessons from the Obama years. That is to say, the inclination to put a lot of effort into a ultimately ill-starred attempt at a bipartisan approach to governing. It'd be very interesting to see. There's a kind of unapologetic liberalism in the traditional sense of the word, a willingness to use quote big government in the pursuit of big ideas, including a more racially just society, including a society where the income disparities are reduced. I mean, there obviously climate change. I mean, we have no shortage of big issues, and it'll be interesting to see if, um, as I say, if this president and what follows is in some ways a reversion to the ambitious reliance upon government that was the hallmark of, quote, modern liberalism.
Let's move to President Eisenhower, Richard. Which of his characteristics do you think contributed to his success as a president?
Well, boy, Ike is a classic example. Reagan, by the way, as well. Of beware of snap judgments or historical assessments. I gave up long ago, as you can imagine, and I'm sure you have been as well. Every 4 years or every 8 years, before the inauguration, before the outgoing president departs, you are targeted by well-meaning journalists and others who want an assessment, a historical assessment of that president and his performance, and you try to explain that you can give nothing more than the most preliminary, first draft for lots of reasons. A lot of the evidence isn't available yet. It takes years for a president's papers to become available. It takes years for people around him to speak candidly in the form of oral histories or books, tell-all books, if you will, or more scholarly treatments of the presidency. It takes years to form perspective. And by that, I mean the kind of detachment. Richard Nixon famously said it would be 50 years before anyone could write objectively about him. And by that, he meant that as a polarizing figure, a particularly polarizing figure, it was the emotions that he stirred up, pro and con, not to mention, of course, the scandals attached to his name. That it would take a long time before we had the, if you will, the distance, the detachment, the objectivity to write. And in the case of Reagan and Ike, well, Eisenhower left office in 1961, and in the first poll of historians after he left, he was ranked 22, one place below Chester Arthur. And 22 is worse than it sounds because there are a lot fewer presidents. There's no doubt that academic historians, many of whom I suspect voted for Adlai Stevenson twice, bought into the somewhat cynical notion of Eisenhower as a grandfatherly, benign, not particularly active, not particularly energetic or imaginative president, a non-Roosevelt president, if you will. There was the New Deal and the Fair Deal, and earlier there'd been TR's Square Deal. Well, the Eisenhower years didn't have a name, and there's a whole part of the culture, the literary, intellectual culture, that quite frankly looked down its collective nose at Dwight Eisenhower. But the fact is, with the passage of time and the forming of perspective, just as people looked at Harry Truman in a much more positive light, Dwight Eisenhower came to be seen increasingly as the most successful of modern presidents, certainly up to and arguably including Reagan. And you can, one way of tracing that is looking at historical assessments. C-SPAN's most recent poll of historians several years ago ranked him 5th, which is pretty remarkable. Why did they rank him 5th? Basically, peace and prosperity. For the most part, we had both. Eisenhower kept the Cold War cold at a time when it was really very dangerous, and a less skillful leader might not have been able to keep the lid on, if you will. Also, Eisenhower has never gotten the credit. Eisenhower was a politically transformative president. People date the modern Republican Party and its strength in the South to the Goldwater campaign in '64. And they overlooked the fact that it was Dwight Eisenhower who in 1952 and again in '56 carried a majority of electoral votes south of the Mason-Dixon line, and I might add, did so with a racially inclusive message. Eisenhower was a Lincoln Republican, not a Goldwater Republican. And indeed, famously, one of the reasons why at the last minute in 1964, he finally privately pushed Bill Scranton, the governor of Pennsylvania, into a hopeless but symbolically important challenge to Goldwater before the Republican convention was, as Scranton told me, he talked to Eisenhower on the phone following Goldwater's vote against the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. And Scranton said to Eisenhower, "How do you feel?" And he said, "Sick." The fact of the matter is, Dwight Eisenhower took considerable pride in his civil rights record. Remember, it was Ike who had sent troops into Little Rock to enforce a court order so that the Little Rock Nine had the same opportunity at a quality education as their Caucasian classmates amid considerable controversy. And in other less publicized ways, Eisenhower had advanced the cause of civil rights. And of course, it was Eisenhower's federal judges in the South, never mind Earl Warren, who was appointed to the court, but it was Eisenhower's federal judges in the South who Dr. King said were frankly the greatest allies that the civil rights movement had in that critical period in the early 60s. So Eisenhower was an unorthodox president in many ways. He was the un-Roosevelt in this sense. He had real reservations about the bully pulpit, the notion that presidential words, presidential exhortation, presidential sermonizing, if you will, could move a country significantly toward a goal or a set of goals. Eisenhower, of course, took a lot of criticism, some of it good-natured, some of it very sharp-tongued about his own syntax. But, his response was, if the American people want to write a president, want a president, who want to elect a president on the basis of his words, then they should vote for Ernest Hemingway.
Richard, that's a great one. What lessons can be learned by the current Republican Party from President Eisenhower?
Well, it's the flip side of what you asked me a few minutes ago, and I have to say, needless to say, I've never discussed this with Senator Dole, but I think I know him well enough. It's no secret that he's always regarded Dwight Eisenhower as his personal hero, and I think that extends to Ike's approach to politics as well. Eisenhower, well, you have to remember, one of the things that made Eisenhower unique, along with George Washington, who was his hero, by the way, the presidency was almost a step down for Eisenhower. The wonderful story that illustrates that, his brother Milton, of course, was a great educator, and at one point was president of the University of Pennsylvania, and he invited his distinguished brother to come and give the commencement address one year. And Ike agreed. And they were in the president's house. Of course, the ceremony was going to be held outdoors, and the skies were threatening, and people were making small talk. And anyway, it may have been Milton, who asked the president, do you think we're going to be able to get this in before the rain comes? And Ike, without hesitating, said, I'm not worried about the weather since June 6, 1944. Well, that, of course, is a reference to D-Day, the day that immortalized Dwight Eisenhower as the man who led, in a very real sense, what he called a crusade to rid the first Europe and more broadly the world, civilization, of the scourge of Hitler and Nazism. And a man who had emerged from the war with Ike's reputation, very much like George Washington emerging from the Revolution. I mean, he was larger than any office, larger than any honor that could be tendered to him. And that included the presidency. And so he brought to the presidency enormous prestige, credibility, but also a kind of humility. It isn't romanticizing the truth to say that in important ways, he never left Abilene. He certainly felt a particular emotional connection to his Kansas roots. Of course, he was born in Texas, but he never for a moment regarded himself as anything other than a son of Kansas. Beyond that, he had this quality. He had charisma. But even more than that, there's a reason why people said, I like Ike. Guess what? They liked Ike. I mean, he had this God-given ability to make people like him and trust him. Boy, if you could bottle that as a politician, you could be a very wealthy man indeed. But beyond that, he had what I would call the charisma of competence. No one questioned Dwight Eisenhower's integrity, and very few people questioned his basic competence. Doesn't mean he was an expert on government by any means, and certainly not, I think as many Republicans would say, an expert in politics. He did not, unlike FDR. Dwight Eisenhower is not a transformative president, the way that we use the term or think of the term. For example, FDR left the Democratic Party profoundly changed, but more important, dominant. It was the nation's dominant political force, certainly well into the 1960s. That was not the case with Eisenhower. There were people in the party who thought he was too moderate. The great divide in the Republican Party, which goes back to our third president, TR, at the beginning of the 20th century. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt had voluntarily stepped aside to his enormous lifelong regret and made way for his handpicked successor, William Howard Taft. And in 1912, the Republican Party split right down the middle between the Roosevelt wing and the Taft wing. And really, for 100 years thereafter, there was still that essential divide within the Republican Party. In the 1930s, William Howard Taft's son, Robert, took on the Eastern establishment, the liberal Republicans, led by Thomas Dewey. In 1952, Dewey masterminded Eisenhower's nomination against who? Robert Taft. But I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure Richard Nixon would have agreed, that in 1960 and even beyond, there was really no sign. Eisenhower, in effect, because of his enormous popularity and his success in office, was able to paper over the division. That story I just told you about Bill Scranton and Barry Goldwater is testimony to just how profound that underlying division within the party was, certainly in 1964. And again, Reagan, it was said that he made it, the Republican Party became Ronald Reagan's party. And that is very largely true. But there remained, even into the 90s, at least a vestigial sort of moderate to liberal wing based in the Northeast and parts of the Middle West. And that's gone. That's entirely gone.
I have one final question tonight, Richard, and I know you just began speaking about President Teddy Roosevelt, and he's someone you felt you really wanted to talk about tonight. So,
Yeah.
talk for a few minutes about what Teddy Roosevelt's characteristics made him a successful president.
Well, first of all, it's almost an accident of timing, maybe. It's almost too convenient. We think of TR as the turn of the century president. We can't imagine TR being in the 19th century. TR is a modern figure. He is forever hailed as the first modern president, whatever that is. I think that maybe gives short shrift to William McKinley, who was more ahead of his time than conventional assessments. But there's no doubt Theodore Roosevelt was a different kind of president. He had some help. There was the modern media, the mass media of his day. The fact of the matter is, newspapers had become a mass medium. TR understood instinctively the theater of politics. He is the first president, for example, to set aside an area in the West Wing of the White House for the press. Before TR, presidents were remote figures. You saw their pictures sometimes in the paper. The presidency was by and large an administrative job. TR almost single-handedly turned it from purely administrative to essentially one of advocacy. That was the whole point of the bully pulpit. And that was aided immeasurably by his sense of the dramatic. He was the best show in town. Henry Adams referred to him as pure act, and I'm not sure he meant it as a compliment. But there's no doubt he was the youngest president in American history. He had a lively, colorful, rambunctious, entertaining family who were brought into the story, and indeed, one might even argue, exploited for their political appeal. But you see, he had the tools available in terms of the mass media of the day. Early film, for example, you could see the president give a speech. You could see a president or first lady or first family against the backdrop of the White House. These things that had been remote became much more accessible, much more personal. TR had a genius for choosing the right enemies. And that, by the way, I would suggest you won't find it on any list of criteria by which to judge presidents, but I would strongly recommend it. And it ran in the family. TR talked about malefactors of great wealth. In other words, what we would call, hedge fund managers on Wall Street. His cousin Franklin, who took office, after all, at the depths of the Great Depression, when the big business community had been thoroughly discredited, He, in effect, picked up on that theme. He talked about the money changers in his inauguration, having fled from the temple. It was us versus them. Shrewd politics. TR was a shrewd politician, but he was also a reformer. He was not, in my estimation, I would not call him a transformative president, but there's no doubt that it wasn't just a show. The TR, you stop and think, the role of government that we associate with the New Deal, for example, really you can go back to Theodore Roosevelt. The idea that a president would not simply administer what Congress had passed, that a president would set the national agenda, that a president would advocate for example, picking up off of the furor caused by Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, that a president would then incorporate into his legislative agenda of the need for food and drug legislation. Today we take these things for granted, but that's a measure of TR's significance. There's something else that can't be quantified. It goes again to this ineffable quality that TR had. He was certainly not uncontroversial, but there are many people who think that he was the most lovable president in American history. If you want to see what I mean, look at Turner Classic Movies or however. There's a 1944 movie comedy called Arsenic and Old Lace, and in it basically two elderly spinster aunts who have developed the habit of polishing off elderly gentlemen with poisoned elderberry wine and then burying them in the cellar. Except they don't do the burying. Their more than eccentric cousin Teddy does the burying. He is a dead ringer for Theodore Roosevelt. He thinks that when he buries them in the cellar, he's digging the Panama Canal. And when he charges up the stairs, as he does periodically with trumpet at full blast, he, of course, is ascending San Juan Hill. The fact is, how many presidents, 25 years after their death, would be such an instantly recognizable cultural icon that you, in effect, could cast him, which is what I'm talking. You're casting the caricature of him, but it was so vivid, even 25 years later. Forget that. 100 years after the fact, TR has been gone now for over 100 years. Maxwell House Coffee is still selling its product under the catchphrase, good to the last drop. Well, good to the last drop is what Theodore Roosevelt said after guzzling multiple cups of Maxwell House coffee more than 100 years ago. I mean, he's the most vivid of American presidents. And that stays with us. That is still debated. That is still amazingly contemporary. However, his impact on our politics was not nearly as lasting. As I say, his successor, William Howard Taft, although he believed he was pursuing the TR policies, certainly TR didn't agree. They split the party in 1912. It was widely believed that Roosevelt could be nominated in 1920, but he died a year before the nominating convention, having spent the last 10 years of his life groping toward a sense of purpose and regretting, I think bitterly, the fact that he had voluntarily renounced a third term.
I should have made clear before my last question that we're going to audience questions at this time. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to Richard Norton Smith, our guest for the Presidential Lecture Series at the Dole Institute this year, Please send the question to dolequestions@ku.edu. dolequestions@ku.edu. And let's go to our first question. Richard, Tyler asks, there have been several studies showing trickle-down economics, a hallmark of the Reagan administration, have not had a positive impact on the U.S. economy. Do you feel this might cause Reagan's legacy and his place among the near great presidents to be reassessed?
You know, it's a very good question. The economic policies were debated at the time. And in fact, I'm almost at a loss to understand why they were not more vigorously debated sort of in the years immediately after the Reagan presidency. But I think there, as I say, something like a consensus formed. Reagan's influence was almost greater after he left office than when he was in office. But there's no doubt, again, the cyclical process of which I speak, and the fact that just as in 1933, a lot of people who had more or less perhaps complacently accepted the dominant themes of, you know, what's good for business is good for America, an unregulated economy, businessmen as heroes throughout the 1920s. By 1933, those assumptions were being widely challenged, and it may very well be that there have been enough economic shocks in the last decade, and more recently still, as I think as a culture becomes, as a society becomes, for example, much more aware of, sensitive to, concerned about income inequities and what appear to be the growing gulf in this country between the 1% and the 99%. That obviously is conducive to exactly the kind of questions that Tyler is raising. And so in some ways, I'm tempted to say watch this space. I think the Biden administration will have a lot to say about the future of supply side economics, at least in the near future.
Okay, our next question is from Clarence, who says, I've read that the relationship between Reagan and House Speaker Tip O'Neill was overblown. Is there any truth to that?
You know, it's a very good question. I don't pretend to be an authority, but I am inclined to sympathize with the questioner. I think it's interesting. Tip O'Neill is a very interesting character. There is no doubt that he and Reagan established a strong personal relationship. But I don't think for a moment that Reagan converted Tip O'Neill, or vice versa. And in the end, isn't that what really counts? What the two men believed, what they fought for, and what they fought against. And I don't think, based on the evidence, that the personal relationship, such as it was, moved the needle.
Zachary asked, in his speech at the 1992 Republican National Convention, the last major speech of his life, Reagan cast a vision of hope for the GOP. In your opinion, can the Republican Party return to that vision? And if so, how?
Well, again, the question, I won't say it answers itself. The question defines itself as the overarching one. I think I don't know whether the Republican Party can or will want to return to an essentially hopeful, I would say inclusive, and above all, again, futuristic. Remember, Reagan signed immigration reform. Reagan believed it was the glory of America that we were, in fact, as George Washington intended us to be, an asylum for the world's oppressed, for victims of political or economic oppression. The fact that America was a magnet to the world's dispossessed was not something to worry about, but something, quite frankly, to take pride in. And that's what I mean when I talk about an inclusive vision. Reagan's conservatism was sufficiently confident about itself and its place in the American canon that it wasn't fearful, and it didn't hate. And those are very large questions that the questioner raises. And the answer, I don't know. Historians, I don't know about anyone else. I have enough trouble trying to make sense out of the past that I can document without pretending to a clairvoyance about a future that I can only imagine.
Clarence has another question. In light of the recent Capitol insurrection, what place do you feel Ronald Reagan would have today in the modern Republican Party?
Well, it's a fair question, and it's a disturbing one in some ways. Again, I don't think Ronald Reagan would be comfortable in this Republican Party. I think this Republican Party, in a lot of ways, is kind of a throwback to some of what Reagan led Republicans and conservatives out of. I mean, in the 30s, it was reflexively anti-New Deal. It was unrelievedly hostile to government programs, and basically it was defined by what it was against. It was a party in many ways defined by its resentments, and certainly not a party that seemed to welcome the cultural trends of its day, or much else, to be perfectly honest with you. And one of Reagan's great signal achievements, it seems to me, was to transform how conservatives were seen by others and perhaps how conservatives saw themselves. So that, if you accept my premise, basically optimistic, futuristic outlook, inclusive, and again, with a smile on its face, I'm afraid those qualities are singularly lacking in much of the Republican Party of Donald Trump.
Tyler asks another question. Given your personal history with President Ford, can you tell us if he and President Reagan healed the rift between them from the '76 primary?
I'm glad you asked. They did. It's interesting. In 1980, at the time of the Republican convention, Ford had thought about challenging Reagan in '80, and he thought better of it. And on the eve of the convention, the Reagans called up the Fords and said, can we come over and visit? And when they did, Reagan very, very shrewdly brought with him a peace pipe, which of course goes right to the nature of Tyler's question. There had been obviously bad blood. They had had a bitter campaign against each other in 1976, but Ford, who loved the Republican Party and who loved the campaign, and I have no doubt would have campaigned for Reagan in 1980, in all candor, much more vigorously than Ronald Reagan campaigned for Jerry Ford in 1976. But Ford was not a guy who held grudges, and although he was a more traditional conservative when it came to his economics. I mean, he certainly was appalled at the new orthodoxy that said deficits don't matter. For example, well, deficits mattered a whole lot to Gerald Ford, but no, on the personal level, they put 76 behind them. I'm told it's interesting when President Reagan, again, small example of the man's grace. When Ford would visit Washington, Reagan would make sure that he came to the White House. And of course, he came to the Oval Office. But then Reagan took the extra step. You've seen the pictures. We've all seen the pictures of the chairs under the portrait, usually of George Washington, in front of the fireplace. And, there's the chair where the president sits and his guest. And Reagan would always insist that Ford take the president's chair. Well, I mean, it's little things like that multiplied. How many times a day did Ronald Reagan perform a gracious act, a generous act? How many friends did he make? How many adversaries did he disarm? I mean, you over a lifetime, that's a pretty significant impact.
Okay, I've got a very interesting question from Zach, which is a very different twist. What can President Biden learn from President Reagan?
Well, I would, and this may surprise you, and it may spark some disagreement. I would, in some important ways, say that Biden, I think, has already learned, or perhaps didn't need to learn, because he already had. I mean, Biden is an upbeat person. Biden likes people. Biden respects people, and he regards, again, adversaries as adversaries and not as enemies. I mean, I think in much the same way, I think clearly Reagan and Biden both have a reverence for the office of the presidency, for the White House, for what it represents to people, absolutely irregardless of partisan identification. So I think in a lot of ways, Ronald Reagan was a happy warrior, and I think of Joe Biden as a happy warrior. And the fact is, they may be fighting for different things, but I think they have some very essential qualities in common.
One final question, Richard.
Another important thing. I mean, clearly President Reagan had great success. Of course, in those days, you've got to remember, it's just 40 years ago, but it's light years ago in terms of the structure of our political parties. The South was still predominantly Democratic, which meant that you had dozens of relatively conservative Democrats in the House and in the Senate who were susceptible to Reagan's appeal. I mean, Reagan got his original tax cut passed only with the help of Southern Democrats. Now, today, they're all gone. The South is much more uniformly Republican, although there are some signs that may be changing. So when Biden arrives in Washington and talks about wanting to be a bipartisan president, or at least have the ability to reach across the aisle in a civil way and talk with his political opponents, it's a much more polarized political culture, obviously. But even more than that, fundamentally, the two parties are different. The two parties have polarized geographically and ideologically, and so I think Biden has the same instincts as Reagan. He would like to be able to talk, as he did his first formal meeting apparently in the Oval Office the other night for 2 hours with I believe it was 10 Republican senators who came to talk about the COVID package, clearly hoping that he would downsize the $1.9 billion figure that we're hearing. I mean, I think he wishes that Washington was still afforded those opportunities that Reagan had. But I think he's also enough of a realist to know that that's unlikely.
One final question tonight, Richard, from William. How did President Reagan's defense policies contribute to the fall of the Iron Curtain?
Well, again, you'll get scholars who argue both ways. I think there's a consensus that they contributed significantly. First of all, by, in effect, against considerable opposition, lining up America's NATO allies to accept the latest generation of nuclear weaponry, and at the very same time that they were at least fitful negotiations aimed at reducing the nuclear menace. And then, of course, I mean, and then, of course, when Reagan introduced what became known as Star Wars, the idea of a missile defense shield, if you will. The theory is that the Soviet Union, which had gone through a series of geriatric, not particularly impressive figures, who, as Reagan said, kept dying on me. Then along came Mikhail Gorbachev, a modern figure, a realist, certainly a communist through and through, but someone who wanted to reform the Soviet Union within a communist framework. And that meant shifting more resources toward a consumer-driven economy rather than a military dominated one. And so when Reagan, in effect, upped the ante by introducing the prospect, I mean, it's no mystery that the one thing Gorbachev wanted, famously at Reykjavik, for example, but I think in terms of arms control, was to avert the start of a new arms race in space, one that he believed the Soviet Union was doomed to lose. They simply didn't have the economic resources to compete with, with the American economy. So I think in that sense, Reagan was something of a prophet, and he was willing to stick to his guns, no pun intended, even if it was unpopular, even if the prevailing view was that he was naive or even a warmonger. And of course, by 1987, you had this extraordinary development, the INF Treaty, with the elimination of the first class of nuclear weapons in the nuclear era, and Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev walking through Red Square in Moscow, kissing babies. I mean, it was a far, far cry from the Reagan who talked about the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And again, it illustrates Reagan's unusual, virtually unique ability to, on the one hand, be perceived as a man of unshakable conviction, and on the other, to be kind of the ultimate pragmatist who could achieve things that no one really thought possible in no small degree, because the very convictions that he espoused would seem to rule them out. In any event, I think Reagan deserves, an enormous amount of credit for not only ending but arguably winning the Cold War. That said, I'm not sure he ever could have done it alone. Mikhail Gorbachev deserves an enormous amount of credit as well. Gerald Ford used to say that all the presidents, going back to Harry Truman, and in the Congresses, Republican and Democratic, and ultimately the American people who were willing to spend what it took and live for 40 years under the near constant threat, at least in theory, under the cloud of nuclear annihilation. I mean, it's like spending 40 years on a window ledge. And yet, the American people summoned up the qualities of perseverance and vision and guts, if I may say, to make sure, at the very least, that they upheld their side in the Cold War. And in the end, it turned out to be a battle of wills and of economies.
Richard, as always, tonight has been extremely educational and entertaining. Thank you so much for joining us.
As always, I am impressed by your questions and the questions from your audience. Thanks for the opportunity to entertain both.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was terrific tonight. I want to thank everyone for joining us and remind you that next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, the same time, we will be addressing FDR and President Clinton and President Obama and what our new president, President Joe Biden, can learn from them. I think it'll be another fascinating and entertaining evening. We hope to see you then. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this evening. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Next week, we are looking forward to hosting Richard Norton Smith on Wednesday, February 17th at 7 p.m. for the second installment of our presidential lecture series, FDR Revisited, Learning from FDR, Clinton, and Obama. You can access this program on the Dole Institute's YouTube channel, just like tonight's program. Refer to the doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. We hope you enjoyed this evening's program. Thank you and good night.